कालपासून जाईल.
नाही आज फोन करा म्हणा, आता आलेले काय करू सांगा म्हणून.
असं दिसत आणि हे मिनिमाइज करून चालू झालं का?
चालू
Very good morning. Here we are continuing with the revision of forensic medicine and toxicology. Identification. You might be remembering the earlier lectures of forensic medicine where the identification was dealt in details. This is important aspect of the medico-legal case. Identification has to be done in most of the cases when the patient is being brought as unknown or the dead body is being brought in a skeletonized, highly decomposed, or sometimes only bones will be brought for post-mortem examination. In such cases, identity remains at the top of the investigation, and then the further opinions are to be sought from the autopsy surgeons and the forensic expert. So identification, what are the various factors are there which will help you to fix the identity, and as you have been taught, identity or the identification is nothing but the individualization of the individuality of the individual is to be fixed. It may be partially fixed or it may be completely confirmed. So partial identity and complete identity. How it can be seen? We will see.
Large brow ridge. The slope of the forehead is also fairly upright. The angle of the jaw is also much less than that you will see on the male. And finally, if you turn it to the back, there are no major nuchal lines. They're there, you can see these kind of bumps. However, they're not nearly as prominent as they were on the male. If you look at the skull as a female skull, you will notice the round orbits of the eye. You'll notice the fairly sharp point to the chin, particularly in this area. You'll notice the cheekbones do not flare out to the sides, they're fairly compact. If you turn
So it is clear that we are getting clues from the various bones. Skull will be helping you at most. Even race, age, sex can easily be determined with the features described. Also, if you want to know the cause of death and time since death, like other aspects of the death, then that can also be seen with the help of with the help of this
In part 1 of this video, I will compare male and female facial features, bone structure, and musculature. In the second part of this video, I will do a demonstration. During this demonstration, I will review what we've learned in the first part and teach you how to draw the nuances of the male and female face. Let's look at the differences of the male and female skull first, and then we will work our way up to the skin. Male and female children have similar skull shapes, but once children hit puberty, the differences start to appear. Testosterone provokes the growth of certain facial features in males, while female faces remain relatively childlike. The presence of higher levels of testosterone give men a thicker bone structure with more prominent bones. Male faces have a wider, more prominent jaw, chin, and cheekbones. The physical size of the male skull is actually larger than the female skull. A very distinct characteristic of the male skull is a protruding supraorbital ridge, also known as the brow line. Female faces are more rounded and tend to have a narrow jawline. They have a softness that the male face lacks. It carries more fat than the male face, especially in the cheeks. Female faces tend to have thicker lips and a higher arch on the top lip. Female eyebrows generally sit a little higher than male eyebrows, and they usually have a thinner and more arched shape, mainly due to plucking. The female nose tends to be smaller, shorter, and have a narrower bridge and nostrils than the male one. Also, female noses often have a straighter or more concave profile. Before we go on to part 2, I want to make this complex subject as simple as possible, so I took notes for you. If you are watching this on YouTube, just hit the link. If not, merylk.com, and download this cheat sheet for when. First thing that I look for is the skull. As I said, I could hear the girls at that mic, there's a, on the, to put that in. From what I'm doing now, presence of a lot of line actually took me longer. But you'll see as we go on, the jawline, too dark in certain areas. Male faces a blending stuff in it underneath the female lip because it protrudes a little bit more. But there's facial hair underneath the male lip, so that can be a little bit deceptive. I'm gonna very conservative with the feet so much, but notice that the female. I sound like a broken record, but hopefully you'll remember.
So this kind of differences are really helping us, and once the autopsy surgeon or the forensic team receive any bones, mainly the skull, the facial reconstructions remains at the priority. On the basis of other features, the facial reconstructions can help to create the exact features of the individual with all those musculature, skin, and the gesture, the texture, the complexions. Those can also be made to some extent, and the individual can be traced with the bone itself by means of facial reconstruction. Here is the small video which can elaborate how the technique of facial reconstructions takes place, though it is the forensic science rather than the forensic medicine which will be working on the facial reconstruction. But it is the right of the forensic expert who can send for facial reconstruction if he want, and even investigating officer can also sought the opinion from the forensic science people to have the facial reconstruction. Just we can visualize
when the usual ways of identifying human remains fail and the When the usual ways of identifying human remains fail and the investigation stalls, police sometimes need a little image building. Using the skull, they recreate the face of the deceased in the hope that it will jog someone's memory. Talk about giving the case a whole new profile. To reconstruct a face, the specialist uses resin to make an exact replica of the unidentified man's cranium. He attaches it to the rest of the skull cast. And now he has an exact copy of the man's skull. Next, he measures rubber pegs to different lengths that are equivalent to the various thicknesses of facial skin. This short one is placed on the forehead, where the skin is thin. Then he installs eyes made of plastic. Those are suction cups protruding from them. They help him to align the eyes. He shines a light into them to confirm that they're looking straight ahead. Next, he cuts out muscle shapes from rolled clay. This piece simulates the area around the mouth. The dead man's muscles have left tension marks on his skull. Those marks, combined with the knowledge of facial anatomy, help to decide where to build up muscle. He makes the face expressionless, because expressions are unique and impossible to extrapolate from a skull. Next, he sculpts muscle around the eyes. There are no clues about the actual shape of the man's eyes, so he gives them a generic look. The skull does divulge the length and width of the nose, as well as the location of the nostrils. Now the specialist builds up the smiling muscles, followed by the fat and salivary gland. He uses different coloured clay so he can see them more clearly. He maps out a location for the ears, but doesn't yet attach them. He shapes the muscles in the neck, working from measurements and photos from the crime scene. Next, he gives the model skin. As he applies this layer of clay, he uses the protruding pegs as thickness guides. And after much sculpting, the model was come to life. But he needs one more clay ear. The skull offers some hints about the ear's size, but not their shape, so he keeps that generic. Now, he sponges the clay to give it some texture, so it looks even more like real skin. Using a digital camera, the artist photographs the model and then downloads the image onto a computer. Using photo editing software, he transfers some hair to the shot of the clay model. He knows from evidence at the crime scene that the man's hair was styled in dreadlocks and that he had a beard. He borrows brows from another photo. Painting the brows with a stylus. Using the same technique, he gives the image facial hair. And the skull mold and clay model alone takes 12 days to complete. Time well spent, because once the pictures and information are posted on police sites like this one, it may finally help them put a name to this face.
So the facial reconstructions remain an important turning point from the investigating point of view. Investigating officers are taking the help of those specialists, and even in India also it has started. So this is one step ahead in the technology, just to reach to the identification of the deceased. Sometimes bone may not be concluding most of the thing, but this kind of reconstructions will help to reach to the conclusion. So not only the skull bone, but other bones are also important, like pelvis, the long bones, which will also helps in fixing the identity. So we can see
differences between the male pelvis and the female pelvis. So to start off with, we're going to look at the pelvic inlet, which is described by the pelvic bridge here, and it is larger in a female than it is in a male. Now, when we look inside, we can see the sacrum, but the coccyx is in a man is much more interior than a woman, where the curve is straight down. Also, the ischial spines in a woman point posteriorly, whereas in male pelvis, they point medially. In the anterior view, we can see the subpubic angle, which is this angle right here. And in a man, it is much more narrow. In a woman, it is much wider. Now we're going to take a lateral view. The greater sciatic notch is here, and it is much wider in a woman than it is in a man. And they have the thumb test, where if you place your thumb in the greater sciatic notch in a male pelvis, it will be tight, whereas it will be loose in the female pelvis.
so the bones are important in fixing the identity. Even bone pieces can be sent for DNA testing, and that will help if the relatives' DNA is available, or the nearby next to kin, or any of the family members' DNA is available for comparison. That will be helpful. But that is the condition required, to have the DNA sample available of the relatives. Individual also has got their own fingerprints. Fingerprint will also be helping in fixing the identity, and identification can be done on the basis of the types of ridges, their patterns, number of pores, and comparison of various core delta, the pattern of whorls, So those characteristics of the fingerprints is another aspect of fixing the identity. So we can further see how this can be done.
Welcome to How to Compare Fingerprints. Today we're going to go over the basics. Before we get into comparing fingerprints, Welcome to How to Compare Fingerprints. Today we're going to go over the basics. Before we get into comparing fingerprints, we need to define a few terms. The most basic formation in a fingerprint is the ridge. These are the black lines that form the patterns. The core of a fingerprint, right here in the center, is the innermost recurve at the center of the pattern. This ridge flows up, recurves right in the middle, and flows back down right here in the middle of the pattern. The delta is this type of feature where three areas converge into a triangle type shape. You can see right here is the center of this delta. The three basic fingerprint patterns are the arch, the loop, and the whorl. The ridges in an arch pattern start on one side of the finger, rise in the middle, and exit out the opposite side. There are usually no cores or deltas in an arch. The ridges in a loop pattern start on one side of the finger, loop in the middle, and exit on the same side they started. There's usually one core right here and one delta in a loop pattern. The loop can face either left, like this one does, or to the right, like this one. The ridges in a whorl pattern form a generally round shape. There are usually two cores, one facing up and one facing down, and two deltas, one on the left and one on the right. Looking closer at a fingerprint, you can see that occasionally the ridges will start and stop as they flow through the pattern. This ridge right here flows upwards and stops right here, while the other ridges on either side converge to fill the space. This is a ridge ending. A single ridge will occasionally split into two ridges. This ridge flows up and splits into two ridges at this point. This is a bifurcation. A dot is this feature where the ridge starts and stops over a short distance, making the ridge approximately only as long as it is wide. When comparing fingerprints, you can usually use a magnifier and a pair of sharp pointers to keep track of things. The magnifier is like a large jeweler's loop. The pointers can be almost anything that's thin at one end, like a pen, a paperclip, or an engraving tool. On the other hand, you can use a scanner to get the fingerprints onto the computer screen and use Photoshop to mark the points in the print. The first step in a fingerprint comparison is to thoroughly analyze the unknown or latent print. In this example here, we have a right slope loop. You can see that the ridges come in from the right-hand side and loop around the middle. I will first adjust the levels so we can have better contrast in the image. As I zoom in, we're going to analyze the condition of the ridges, how well we can see them, what points and features we can see, and where they are. So I'm going to use the pencil tool to mark these points, the ridge endings and bifurcations. The first one is this center ridge that joins with the ridge that curves around it. As we count to the left, we skip 1, 2, 3 ridges, and the fourth ridge is a ridge ending that faces up. It's a little hard to see, but the next ridge to the left is a bifurcation that faces upwards. The next ridge to the left is a bifurcation that faces downwards, and the next ridge is as well. Counting up from there, we skip 1 and 2 ridges. This third ridge stops with a ridge ending. Skipping one ridge, the second ridge is another ridge ending. Coming down this ridge and skipping one to the left, the second ridge is a ridge ending that flows down to a bifurcation. Counting from this bifurcation, we can count to the right 1 and 2 to another bifurcation. Skipping 2 ridges, the third is another ridge ending. I'll mark a few other points that are fairly easy to see, and there are plenty of other points that I'm leaving out in this video. As we bring up the known fingerprint, we begin the next phase of the comparison process, which is the comparison phase, where we look back and forth between these two prints, looking for matching points that are in the same relative position in both prints. We can see that, first of all, this print is also a right slope loop. We want a clear starting focal point to use as a starting point for the comparison. For these prints, the core is clear and easy to find to use as our starting point. Here we have the same ridge that comes up and ends in the ridge that curves around it. Counting to the left 4 ridges, we find this upward ridge ending. The next ridge is an upward bifurcation, and and the next two ridges are downward bifurcations. As we count up from there, we have a ridge ending on the third ridge and another ridge ending on the second ridge past that one. Skipping one ridge, we find another ridge ending with a bifurcation below, just like in the latent print. There is another bifurcation on the second ridge to the right, and a ridge ending on the third ridge past that. I'll now mark the rest of the corresponding points, and you can see that everything lines up to be the same in the two prints, with each point about the same distance apart and, more importantly, that the ridges have the same unit relationship, meaning that these ridge endings in both prints have exactly one ridge between them, and that these 2 points have exactly 2 ridges between them in both prints. The third phase in the comparison process is the evaluation phase. We look at the similarities and any differences that we found during the comparison phase and come to a conclusion of identification, exclusion, or inconclusive. For this example, there are enough clear features that share the same orientation and unit relationship in both prints to come to the conclusion of identification that these two prints were made by the same finger.
So this kind of comparison is very much helpful for the fingerprint experts when the deceased or sometimes the accused is to be traced, even deceased with the unidentified history can be traced by taking the fingerprint, and then comparison can be done whether any data is available there with them. And because presently the Aadhaar and unique identification number is provided on the basis of your fingerprints, so those data can be very much helpful in identification. If the deceased fingerprint is to be taken and then sent it for the comparison for the forensic fingerprint experts, accordingly that can also be matched. Accused fingerprinting is the main area in the investigations, because the accused may left their fingerprint at the scene of crime, on the weapon, even sometimes on the dead body of the individual, on the deceased, on the victim, and accordingly those can be lifted up properly with the appropriate method of lifting, and then developed it and then compared it. So this sequence will be helping the investigating officers with the opinion of the forensic fingerprint experts. We can further see another video there. See, this is the way the comparison can be made. The larger area is exposed. Again, the ridges are studied well. We have seen the plain and roll type of method of obtaining the fingerprint. You have seen sometimes we have to cover the more area of the fingerprint to compare the patterns, to compare the matching points there. So that's why it is better to take the rolled, better to obtain the fingerprinting by means of rolled method. So one more can be done. See, this kind of computerized techniques are available, and they will match and they will confirm. Because nowadays with the advancing technology, if the data is available, so this can be done with the softwares also. Only thing, the fingerprint of the individual is to be obtained during the lifetime, and after the death and during the process of autopsy or the further investigation, If it will also be again obtained, then these two can be matched with this kind of software, and it will help for fixing the individuality, that is identification of the person. So one more thing is the sometimes tattoos are being made, and if
Tattoos come and go, and
those
their meaning has differed
those
greatly across
those
cultures. The
tattoo
practice is that meanings all over the world.
those will be helping to conclude about the pattern of fingerprinting, the patterns of tattoos they are being made, which kind of ink is used. So those will be helping. We can see how
Was
those can be
modeled
made.
after Thomas Edison's engraving machine and ran on electricity. Tattooing machines used today insert tiny needles loaded with dye into the skin at a frequency of 50 to 3,000 times per minute. The needles punch through the epidermis, allowing ink to seep deep into the dermis, which is composed of collagen fibers, nerves, glands, blood vessels, and more. Every time a needle penetrates, it causes a wound that alerts the body to begin the inflammatory process, calling the immune system cells to the wound site to begin repairing the skin. And it is this very process that makes tattoos permanent. First, specialized cells called macrophages eat the invading material in an attempt to clean up the inflammatory mess. As these cells travel through the lymphatic system, some of them are carried back with a belly full of dye into the lymph nodes, while others remain in the dermis. With no way to dispose of the pigment, the dyes inside them remain visible from the skin. Some of the ink particles are also suspended in the gel-like matrix of the dermis, while others are engulfed by dermal cells called fibroblasts. Initially, ink is deposited into the epidermis as well, but as the skin heals, the damaged epidermal cells are shed and replaced by new dye-free cells, with the topmost layer peeling off like a needle sunburn. Blistering or crusting is not typically seen in professional tattoos, and complete epidermal regeneration requires 2 to 4 weeks, during which excess sun exposure and swimming should be avoided to prevent fading. Dermal cells, however, remain in place until they die. When they do, they are taken up, ink and all, by younger cells nearby, so the ink stays where it is. But with time, tattoos do fade naturally, as the body reacts to the alien pigment particles, slowly breaking them down to be carried off by the immune system's macrophages. Ultraviolet radiation can also contribute to this pigment breakdown, though it can be mitigated by the use of sunlight. But since the dermal cells are relatively stable, much of the ink will remain deep in the skin for a person's whole life. But if tattoos are embedded in your skin for life, is there any way to erase them? Technically, yes. Today, a laser is used to penetrate the epidermis and blast apart underlying pigment colors of various wavelengths, black being the easiest to target. The laser beam breaks the ink globules into smaller particles that can then be cleared away by the macrophages. But some color inks are harder to remove than others, and there could be complications. For this reason, a tattoo is still more difficult than getting one, but not impossible. So a single tattoo may not truly last forever, but tattoos have been around longer than any existing culture, and their continuing popularity means that the art of tattooing is here to stay.
So likewise, the tattoos can also be helping the autopsy surgeons, the investigating officer, for fixing the identity. Because sometimes which kind of ink is used, which kind of tattoo is being made, the religions, the mentality of the individual can be traced. Sometimes the name of the individual will be carved and it will be tattooed. So those things will be helping to the autopsy surgeon, and accordingly the opinion can be made. So identification is very important turning point in the investigation of any of the crime. So those can be made even from various available things, like if skeletonized body is there, the bones will be helping, the fingerprints will be helping, and the tattoo also. So I request you to go through the details so that you can have the further idea about the topic, because very soon we are going to have your mock test and the topics will be conveyed to you day wise, the mock test 1, mock test 2 wise. The number of mock tests will be taken in a due course. Hopefully one per week will be planned, but if it is advised to have more than one, that can also be planned as per the superior's orders. But the topics will be conveyed to you, and it will be mostly of MCQs, and 50 MCQs will be given to you. Those will be sent through the emails, and the links will be sent. The Google form will be the platform on which you have to attend those 50 MCQs on those various topics. So please be aware of your coming mock test, prepare accordingly, and stay home, stay safe. Thank you.